The Gemara on Daf Lamed Ches Amud Beis, page 5 in the Maramakaimos pages, just before the Mishnah, brings in the boya of Rav Ashi, Pino mimecham lemecham mahu. Rashi explains that the boya of the Gemara of Pino mimecham lemecham mahu means that the kumkumus shemechamim boy hachamin, the pot in which the receptacle in which the chamin, in which the hot liquid is being cooked, if one takes that chamin and places it in a second receptacle, can one then be machzir that kli kibul al ha'esh? Rashi says, "Mihave kimat min lechatchila va'osel achzir mikira eloi." We'll recall from our very first limud of Chazara that Rashi always conceives the Isser of Chazara in terms of Atmana. And therefore, essentially, Rashi is saying that Pino mimecham lemecham, by taking the tavshil out of one keli and placing it in another, is that considered a chazara, or does that become a new shehiyah b'Shabbos? The Gemara remains with the boya d'leiv shita, but the Rishonim bring, and it's primarily the Rambam who is the first Rishon which brings this shaila. And the Ramah is brought by, the Rambam is brought by the Ramah in the Shulchan Aruch's pages, page 53. The Ramah says that despite that Pino mimecham lemecham, changing the keli in which the oichel is a boya d'leiv shita, and we'll come back to the hachra of the achronim in that shaila b'li there. But says the Ramah, if one fulfills the tnoi chazara, says the Ramah, the discussion of Pino mimecham lemecham is if we change the container of the oichel, the kedera. But to change the kira on which the kedera is placed, that the Ramah says, and that's based on the Rambam, is mutter. Oz mutter lahachziroi afilu lekira acheres. Bir HaGra, the Gra says that the makor of this Ramah, which comes from the Rambam, is a Yerushalmi. The Magen Avraham, though, brings in Sifkot and Chof Gimel. The Magen Avraham brings the end of the Lashon of the Rambam, where the Rambam adds, Avalim hoisa bitchila temuna. What happens in a case where the kedera is not haloesh, but it's tomun, it's wrapped? In that case, can one remove it from the hatmana and place it on a kira? Says the Magen Avraham, in that case, and this is based on the Rambam, osir. It's osir to do that. We only allow the kedera to be moved from one kira to a second kira. But to remove it from a different state where the choyim of the kedera is being maintained and move that onto the kira, that's awesome. What's the svara behind this din? So if you look on page 77 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages, Sifkaton Samech Beis, Zok the Mishnah Berurah. He says the heter of moving it lakira acheres he brings from the Magen Avraham, va'afilu im havla meruba mishal rishayna. Even if the heat of the second kira is greater than the first, which means that we would have thought that perhaps if the heat of the second kira is greater than the first, that should again be called a shia chadasha. Is that the Magen Avraham? Kira lakira is mutter. Mikol mokoim loy have a rak bichlal chazara v'shari. It's just considered chazara. I don't need, says the Mishnah Berurah, to put the kedera back to the original kira that the shehiyah originally was done on. I can put it onto a different kira. First is the Mishnah Berurah. Avalim bit mihoisa betchila timuna b'davar she'ena meisef havel u'b'Shabbos bolo yeshiva lakira, and on Shabbos you come to put it on the kira elehipuch. Oser, why? Dezehu pe'ula chadasha. Because from hatmana to being on a kira, there isn't enough similarity between these two means of heat that we can say that placing on the kira is not a shehiyah chadasha. In short, the klal advarim of the Yerushalmi, the way the Mishnah Berurah is explaining the Magen Avraham, is that as long as we consider that the second Chazara is similar enough to the first, that it's just a continuation of the original Shehiyah, namely, we fulfilled the very definition of what Chazara means, it's mutter. Even if it would be Havla Meruba Mishal Rishayna, it's still mutter, because there isn't an appreciable enough difference between the first Kira and the second Kira that we should say that the second Kira is a Shehiyah Chadasha. But whereas says the Magen Avraham, if it was first Tomun, even though the Hatmana retains the heat, is there to retain the heat of the Kedera, to then put it on the Kira is a Pu'ula Chadasha, there's a new act, and therefore would be considered Shia B'tchila B'Shabbos, which is also even if it's Gara from Katan. We'll get to that Shaila Be'ez Hashem B'Hemshech, that will be one of the Shailas.
Okay, so on the chat there was a question, is what's the Negela Maisa Shailas, but here we had one, can you move things around in a blech? So we'll get to it.
We'll get to that, B'linedi, yes. Now, once we have this klal, that as long as there's enough similarity between the original state of the Kedera al Gabe Ha'esh and the second place that one wants to, or the second matzav in which one wants to put the Kedera. So the Chazinish on page 105 in the Maramakomis, Siman Lamed Zayin Sivkot and Yud. Chazinish Dibur Mascha Siman, the first piece of Chazinish in the Sivkoton, brings the psak of the Ramah from the Rambam, that if one has fulfilled the conditions of Chazara, of Oida Biyoda, and Daitel HaChzir, and so on, then one can be machzir afilu lekira acheres, even to a different kira. Zot the Chazanish, uba Mishnah Berurah shom b'shem HaRambam, and the Mishnah Berurah brings this quote to the Magen Avraham, which is based on the Rambam. Afilu im havlo meruba mishal rishayna. The second kira can have more intense heat than the first kira, and it's still mutter because kira to kira is similar enough that it's not considered a pula chadasha.
I mean, one gas to another gas on a range, is that the
one gas to another gas on the range would be an example.
And one is higher.
And one is higher, correct. So that would be mutter.
That's the answer to Rabbi Gans's question.
Yeah, okay. Venire, zok the Chazanish, de afilu mismicha le algabo mutter. That even if the original state of the Kedera was just somuch to the kira, not on the kira, and the Chazanish says venir. The Chazanish doesn't have a clear makar for this in either Rishonim or earlier Poskim. The Chazanish is saying it misvara. We'll try and understand the Chazanish's svara and then try and find the makar. I'm sorry? On smicha? Not necessarily. We'll have to see about al gabi karka. We're assuming it's on some type of stand near the kira. We'll discuss karka. The simple case would be, and we'll see this in the Gemara, the straightforward illustration of smicha is, we'll see in the Gemara in Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, the kira has walls, and the kedera is placed on a table, on any kind of stand, next to the kira, so that the heat of the kira is radiating onto the kedera, but there is a mechitza mafsekes between the two.
AKA smicha.
The sugi of smicha and Daf Lamed Zayin, which we'll see in a moment inside. Zog the Chazanish, if the kedera is now just samuch, not al gabi kira, and then one wants to move it to al gaba. Now we're talking about the kira is obviously gara from katum. If not for that, chazara would be also. But one wants to move it from being samuch to al gaba. Mutter, zot the Chazanish. Misvara the Chazanish says it's mutter. Why? Zot the Chazanish, I have a simple raya. We saw from the end of the Magen Avraham, based on the Rambam, that the Yerushalmi limits changing the placing of the Kedera from one kira to another by saying that from Hatmana to the kira is Asa. Why does the Yerushalmi, not the Chazanish, have to illustrate it in the case of Hatmana to a kira? That seems much more reasonable and less of a chiddush that would be called a pula chadasha. Why? Because Hatmana is never a moisiv hevel. We're going to learn about that Be'ez Hashem in the next limudim. Hatmana is only ever mutter on Shabbos if the purpose of the hatmana or the function of the hatmana is only to maintain chayim. So therefore, we can readily understand that moving it from hatmana to akira, of course, is a pula chadasha. Akira is always a moisif hevel. We have encountered a number of times the machloikis between Roiv of the Rishonim and Rashi, that even akira grufon k'tumo is still considered a moisif hevel. Poshut. Mele is not the Yerushalmi poshut. You can't take it from hatmana to akira. That's certainly a pula chadasha. But Zod the Chazon Ish have another case. What about taking it from smicha, where it's not hala'ish, to placing it on top of the kira? The Yerushalmi could have said that case.
So in other words, it's sort of like half on fire.
Which it would be a much greater chiddush to say that that's considered a pula chadasha, because the kira is already receiving its heat from this kira.
Kedera.
And the kedera is receiving its heat from this kira, apologize. And hu adin, that it already is Meisiv Hevel to it.
That's why it gives this portion is still closer.
Hatmana is closer than Agabi Kira? That's what you think in Svara? Wow. Why? Hatmana to Akira is less of is mutter and smicha al gaba. Hatmana also is. Hatmana also is. You can't be matman on top of Akira. We're going to learn that Beis Hashem Nezukas. You go matman on top of the Kira. You were matman on Davash Meisiv Hevel.
The Shiloh
even though the hatmana doesn't come, the Rishonim say from the material of the hatmana. But if you're matman on top of the Eisha, being matman on top of Meisiv Hevel, as I help the Rishonim.
The question was: does the smicha need to be done before Shabbos? Can you do the smicha on Shabbos?
So we'll get to that, Beis Hashem.
Good question, Blazer. We'll get into it.
Let's take that step by step. Beis Hashem, we'll get to that, but we'll get into that in a moment. Zog the Chazon Ish, v'lo osru by Yerushalmi elami tamina l'shihui. The Yerushalmi only asa taking it from a state of atmana to being shayal gabi kira. Avol kol shihui achasi. Zog the Chazon Ish, being somuch is also a shehiyah. The only difference between al gabo and somuch law, we'll see in a moment in the Rishonim, is that since the Rishonim say there is a doifen, there's the wall of the kira separating between the kedera and the eish, so therefore smichos avoids the chashash of chitui. But in terms of is it considered al ha'eish, it's just as much al ha'eish in smicha as it is when it's al akira. And therefore, says the Chazon Ish, from shihui, one can bring a kedera from smicha to shihui, as I state in Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish says it's a nira. There's no clear makar in the Kadmonim, it's a diuk from the Yerushalmi. And Nish, the Yerushalmi should have said the case of Isser, even in the case of smicha to al-gab.
So right now, what we're saying is you can go from smicha to shehiyah.
To shehiyah, correct. Because of the Chazon Ish,
but not the sinul chatchila. Could you go from the sinul chatchila?
We'll get to that in a moment. Let's take that step.
But it has to be garaf and kotum.
Has to be garaf and kotum. Without that, chazara is impossible.
And mevushal kotzarcha.
And mevushal kotzarcha. Otherwise, we have chashash b'shal deraisa, according to those Rishonim.
Right.
Yeah. Now, let's expand a little on the Chazon Ish and explain the chiddush of the Chazon Ish, and then try, as was asked before, to define the parameters of the Chazon Ish's chiddush. We find two different cases that come under the broad category of smicha. On the Maramakamis, let's look on page 2 on the Gemara on Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph. When the Gemara discusses is smicha mutter. Now, to emphasize, smicha bepashtus in the Gemara, and we touched on this once before in a previous limud, and we'll review again. Bepashtus, the case of smicha is to be soymech be'erev Shabbos. And the shaila of the Gemara is, does smicha avoid the problem of shema yechate because there's a mechitza of the kira being mafsik between the Eisha and the Kedera, and therefore we avoid the chashash chitu. That's the shaila of the Gemara. Now, the maskana of the Gemara is that smicha is mutter. One can be soymech to a kira soymech to a kira erev Shabbos, even though the kira is not garaf and katum, because the mechitza mafsekes avoids the problem of Shema Yichat. Now, Zok Taisus, the very bottom Taisus on the Amud. So right hand of the page is photocopied in the reverse, so the Taisus is on the inner part of the page. Toshema Kira Shesikua Umasik. The Gemara's maskana is the shori lismoich. Smicha is mutter. Umikol mokim en lilmoid mikan lismoich etzel ha'esh. There's another case of smicha, which is different to this case. What would be if there would be in the lashon of the Gemara later? There would be a madura, a strong fire. Which one? Thank you. And one would want to be soimech. One would want to place the kira, the kedera, in close proximity to that eish, in order that the heat from the madura should radiate and warm up the kedera. Is that mutter also? Zok Tosfos for fireplace of the example. Zok Tosfos, no. Shani hocha the doifnei kedera mafsikim beinoi lebein haish. The heter of the Gemara of smicha to avoid the chashash of chitu is because there's a barrier between the eish and the kedera. But if the kedera would be exposed to the eish, then Tosfos says the din can't be proved from this Gemara. Can't be proved from this Gemara. If we look on page 20 of the Maramakonis, the Rosh discusses the parameters of when and when not can one be soimech to an open eish. So again, the Gemara in Daf Lamed Zayin, which is discussing Mahu Lismoich, is relating to the Shaila of Smicha next to a Kira with a Doif and Mafsik. We're discussing now a different Shaila, which is to be Soimich to a Madura, to be Soimich to an open fire. The Rosh says that based on the Gemara and Daf Mem, it seems to be mashma that one is allowed to place a kedera keneged hamadura next to a flame. So the Rosh asks the Shaila, and the Rosh will begin the Rosh 6 lines down from the top of the Rosh, the small ois beis, which is the Hagoy Sabach. The Rosh says ule'el asrinon. Says the Gemara before in the beginning of Kira, asas lahosim al gabe Kira afa pisha grufu ktuma, afa pisha nizbashal atabshal me'erev Shabbos v'lespe mishum bishul. Says the Rosh, this Gemara seems to be mavur that I can place something cold near a flame even on Shabbos. Zot the Rosh, how could that be mutter? The flame isn't garuf and kotum, and chazara on top of an eish that's not garuf and kotum is certainly osir on Shabbos. So how can I put it near the eish? Zot the Rosh, umiu, says the Rosh says, v'yesh loima diyesh l'chalik ben lahosim al gabe kira, placing it on top of the kira, then lemedura. The ha kedera al gabe kira osir av etzel hamedura shari mishum dedomi l'soymech v'shari. Says the Rosh, we have a Gemara that smicha is mutter. Zok the bir alocha, the Rosh is saying, note, that smicha even on Shabbos is mutter. Because what are we talking about here, the Rosh is saying? The Gemara and Daf Mem is talking about, can I take something cold and put it samach to the Madura on Shabbos? And the Rosh asks, how could that be? You can place something on an eish that's not garif and kotum on Shabbos, it's shia l'chatchit, shia b'tchila. So the Rosh, no. Here, because you're putting it a distance from the eish, it's not on top of the fire, it's next to the fire. It's keneged hamadura. Keneged hamadura is like soimech. And soimech, we just learned to Gemara and Daf Lamed Zayin, is mutter. Zot the bir alocha state in the Rosh that smicha b'Shabbos is mutter. That should address for the first time, and we'll come back to it, the shaila that was asked before. The Rosh is mavur smicha b'Shabbos is mutter. Zot the Rosh, I have a Gemara that as long as the kedera isn't placed alo eish, there's no problem of shia b'tchila, even on Shabbos. Zot the Rosh, but what do we do with Tosfos? Tosfos said the only reason why smicha is mutter is because there's a doif and mafsik, and here there's no doif and mafsik. How can you compare the two? So the Rosh says enechanami. Zot the Rosh miulay domi kulei hay l'soimech. It's not the same. The hosa mafsik kaisle akira. Aval hochashu etzel amedura havi lelemecha shema yichate. Maybe he'll be mechata the Madura to increase the heat to the Kedera. You have to put it a certain distance from the Madura. So Zot the Rosh, it's only mutter to be soimech to a Madura b'Shabbos where there's no doif and mafsik, where it's a significant enough distance that wouldn't be the normal placing you would do in order to be able to that the heat from the Madura should radiate to the Kedera. So since you made a heker by putting it a little further, that avoids the chashash of Shemei Yechata.
Distance is a hecker?
Distance is a heker. They state in Rosh. Why? What's his svara? It's not because the distance is a heker. It means, like we discussed in a previous limud, since it's placed more distant, we don't see the kedera as being as much alo eish, and therefore the Gzeres Chacham doesn't apply to it in the same way. It's not as associated with the eish as putting it samach eish. So Rabbi said we have two dinim. The pashtus of the Rosh is mashma that you could be soymech to a kira on Shabbos, and you could be soymech to a madura on Shabbos. The reason why it's mutter to be soymech to a kira on Shabbos is because there's the doifen mafsik, and therefore you won't be mechate. The reason why it's mutter to be soymech to a madura on Shabbos is because since there's a herchek, so memela there's a heker, and you won't come to be mechate.
Not according to Tosfos.
I'm sorry?
Not according to Tosfos.
Not according to? Correct. And that's an excellent point. Tosfos is telling us that we can't bring a proof from the Gemara. We can't bring a proof from the Gemara. But the Rosh can be mechadish that if I have another Gemara later, which is mashma, that smicha is mutter, I can't prove that smicha is mutter from the Gemara and the Lamed Zayin. And therefore, I might have to make a difference between the two. Tosfos isn't saying that I cannot be mechadish any heter for smicha. Tosfos is just saying you can't prove it and learn it from the heter of smicha to akira. And therefore, we'll have to be mechadish, says the Rosh, that it needs to be a further distance away.
Anytime you have a wall, by definition,
The question is, why isn't the wall mafsik under all cases? The answer is sometimes it's not. The heat radiates through.
But in which case, maybe I didn't understand the shayla. Yeah.
by definition, whenever there's a wall, you're a distance away from it. So when the brush is on the wall kind.
Oh, right. That's an excellent point. And the answer is that the wall may be very thin, and I can bring the kedera right up to the wall, and it will be a hefsek koldu between them. It's just that the hefsek means I'm not going to be mechata the ish. So in the chanami,
so it only works under Shemi Yechata?
I'm sorry?
It only works under Shemi Yechata?
Only works under what's about mechsek imavashel?
Yeah.
We'll get to that, Be'ez Hashem. We'll get to that, Be'ez Hashem.
A thin wall is definition distance.
Not necessarily. Well, what you're really asking Rabbi Yisai is that the Rosh isn't clear what that distance is. So maybe we'll try briefly. It's not directly our Indian. We'll just try briefly see the lashonis of the Mishnah Berurah. So let's begin on page 73.
Okay, so the Rav is trying to help us be magdir, the smicha and the wall in between and the differences. Okay, I'm just helping you on while we turn. Where are we going to?
Page 73 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages.
Page 73.
So we said, according to the Rosh, what emerges from the Rosh is a heter. To be soymech etzel akira, right? The wall case, the case of Tosfos. On Shabbos, Rabbi say, it's mavur in the Rosh. One can take a kedera, place it right up to the kira, as long as there's a kaisel being mafsik, that's mutter on Shabbos. As is pashas mashma in the Rosh. What's ladina? If we look in the Mishnah Berurah in Sivkot and Tezvav, page 73 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages. Zok the Mishnah Berurah yesh oimen. Some say Doloi Sharina. We're only matir ki masmicha be'erev Shabbos. We're only matir the hefsek mechitza that avoids the problem of Shemei Yechata to take care of the problem of shihiyah, but not to allow placing on Shabbos. Aval lahachzir b'Shabbos oser afilu b'smicha. The makar of that, Zok the Sharat Zion and Sivkot and Yotes, is a Rabbi Kiva Eger in the way that Rabbi Kiva Eger understood a Magen Avraham. Let's continue, and then we'll see the HaRav from the Rosh. Zok the Mishnah Berurah weiter. Aval lahachzir b'Shabbos oser afilu b'smicha. Let's continue from, then we'll just leave out the next sentence for the moment, continue from where the letter Chof in parentheses is in the Mishnah Berurah. Aval, kama achroinim cholkim al zeh. V'daitom de chazara b'smicha mutter l'kulei alma. V'afilu b'smicha l'chatchila b'Shabbos yesh mekilim. Not just are there achroinim that are matir, that one can be machzir to a smicha, meaning it begun Erev Shabbos Samuch, and one can return it to a state of smicha on Shabbos, but one can even be soymech l'chatchila on Shabbos. Azay state in the Mishnah Berurah, and he brings this b'shem the base. I'm sorry? Correct. I should be able to take a kedera without any having been placed on Eish and be soimichet lechatchila on Shabbos. Azay state in Mishnah Berurah. The mutter shom laha, he says, the Mishnah Berurah says, there are achroinim afilu b'smicha lechatchila b'Shabbos yesh mekilim. Who is the yesh mekilim? The yesh mekilim, the Beis Meir brings it b'shem the Beis Meir. That's correct, because that's a bishul issue. That if you're putting it's so close to the fire that it could become reheated, we have an issue that if it's not mavushal called sarko, or it contains in it liquid, and the liquid already cooled, therefore we have a bishul issue. But, correct, but not because of the issue of chazara. And thank you for pointing that out. We're just focusing narrowly on chazara. So we have a broad machlokes achronim. Can one, and the question that Rav Shlomo asked before, can one be soimich lechatchila b'Shabbos? Aser or mutter? So we have Rabbi Kiva Eiger that says, Rapi the Magen Avraham, no. We have the Beis Meir that is makel not just to be machzir to smichus b'Shabbos, but even to be soimich lechatchila. So we have 3 days. Only shihiyah b'samuch is mutter. One could be machzir to samuch, or one can be shoya lechatchila b'Shabbos samuch. And so you say, Zok the Bir Halacha, we'll just see briefly the Bir Halacha, in the very last lines of Dibra Maschel Mutter Lismeichla. So Dibra Maschel Mutter Lismeichla begins in the Bir Halacha 5 lines from the top, where there's a star, an asterisk, Mutter Lismeichla. If you go down to almost the end of the Mishnah Berurah, in the end of that Bir Halacha, 3rd line from the end, Umashe Kosavnu ba Mishnah Berurah, that which we wrote in the Mishnah Berurah, the Afilu b'smicha lechatchila yesh mekilim, who besefer Beis Meir ayin shom, sefer Beis Meir, contemporary Rabbi Kiva Eiger. V'gam zok the Mishnah the Bir Halacha ktsas machlazeh. There is some support for this. Meharosh peret kira siman yud mashekosav, and we made this cheshem Rabbi Isai, the etzel hamadura, which is mutter on Shabbos. Why? Shori misum the domi l'soimei. Zok the Mishnah Berurah Bir Halacha I found in the Rosh Mefurish that the reason why on Shabbos you're allowed to put it a distance from the Medura is because it's like Soimech. Just like Semichos takes care of the problem of Chitui, placing it at a distance from the Medura also doesn't have a chashash of Shema Yechata. Zok the Bir Halacha, when is the Rosh talking about? He's talking about taking something cold and putting it Keneged HaMedura on Shabbos. It was like Semichos Mutter on Shabbos. I don't know, Rabbi Yisai, and perhaps the Olam can be ma'ayin further, why the Mishnah Berurah only says V'gam K'tzas Machlazeh. It's a Raya Tzuma. It's mafurish.
To write the smach to the smicha.
It's a k'tzas smach to the heter of smicha. Perhaps the Bir Halacha means it's somewhat k'tzas smach lozeh. It's a raya tzuma. Is there another way to learn the Rosh? But the Hasa Rosh is a clear tzad leheter.
But we know that there's a halach of smicha. I mean, that we know.
So if smicha is mutter b'Shabbos, k'tzas smach lozeh, l'cher we have a mafurish Rosh.
Excellent.
Azoi is mavur Rosh. Therefore, Rabbi Yisai, to summarize, we have 2 different cases of smichos. We have being soimech next to Akira of Hefsek, which we see the Mishnah Berurah says is a broad machlokes achronim if that's mutter b'Shabbos. And then we have a Rosh, which is brought lahaloch and Shulchan Aruch, and this is not in the booklet, but in Siman Shin Yud Ches Sif Tes Vov. That's in the halachas of Bishul, which we'll learn Be'ezer Hashem in the coming weeks. The Mechaber says, Dovorshin is Vashal called Sarkai. Again, we're speaking about Dovorshin is Vashal called Sarkai, so we don't have a Bishul issue. Ruvuhu Yove She'ein by Merek, it's dry, so there's no issue again of Bishul and Dovalach. Mutter lahanichoy kneged haMedura, afilu b'makom she'yad ledes boy. You can put it opposite the Medura, even if there's not yad ledes boy. Bavant the Mishnah Berurah, and that's a shaila that was asked before. Bishloima, that it's at a distance, so there's no chashash chitui. That's good. But what about Rabbi Yisai Mechsekim Vashel? We know that the Mishnah Berurah consistently is matik from the Rashba and the Ran that the issue of Shehiyah b'Shabbos is because of Mechsekim Vashel. So how's Hanocha Keneged HaMedura Mutter I Mechsekim Vashel? Zot the Mishnah Berurah that the reason is Bezeshem Amidoy Keneged HaMedura she'ein derech b'nei Odom b'roiv pa'amim levashel kach. That's not the conventional means of being mevashel. Memela is not the Rashba. There's no Mechsekim Vashel.
We know that from Sif Hey. Sif Hey is mutter. Pandish is mutter because it's not derech bishul.
That's correct. We have other instances of not derech bishul, and this we're saying is that even though it's not al gabi kedera, it's samuch to the ish, but that's not derech bishul b'kach.
Bishul is on a pot on the fire. That's the that's derech bishul. Side or on top of another contraption is not. That's your question earlier. What's mazlikim b'bushel?
So that's the din. So in Siman Reish and Gimel, we have the halacha that we can be Seimech Etzel Kira with a hefsek of a mechitza. In Siman Shin Yud Ches Sif Tes Vav, we have Smichus Etzel O'esh, where the Mishnah Berurah says in Tzadik Gimel, Lohoirois, the lashon is Keneged Hamadura, Shetzorach La'achik Ktsas Min Hamadura. And the Mishnah Berurah doesn't give us a clear definition. The Mishnah Berurah doesn't give us a clear definition of what La'achik Ktsas means. And we'll try to get Lineda to come back to that.
If you can take the kedera from smicha to put on top of the kedera or akira, it has to be only yuvish or only could be any liquid, any tune, anything. It's not clear what the halacha is in terms of what type of tafshil.
Yes, Beli Neder, we will try and come back to that. Beli Neder, and please remind me of the shaila, and we'll try to come back to that. So we have two cases of smichus. A smichus of keneged amadura, that's mutter, and we have a smichus that's mutter where there's a keder mafsekes according to the maskana of the Mishnah Berurah based on the Beis Meir. Now, the Chazon Ish has told us, let's go back to the Chiddush of the Chazon Ish, which he says is a diuk in the Yerushalmi, but is a veneer of the Chazon Ish. If the kedera was somuch to the eish, then one can put it on top of an eish that's gara from cotton. Now, what's the case of smichus that the Chazon Ish is talking about? Is he talking about a case of smichus that would be mutter on Shabbos? Or is he talking about a case of smichus that was done erev Shabbos, but that I would not be able to do on Shabbos? For example, we learned that in order to be able to be soymech to akira, there has to be a mechitza mafsekes, right? Let's say it's somuch to the eish without a mechitza mafsekes, but I put it too close to the eish to be matir Shabbos. So that smichus would be osir on Shabbos. Or if we argue with the Beis Meir, you can't be soymech at all on Shabbos to akira. So now Rabbi say, let's be ma'ayin. The Chazon Ish says that the svara of why I can move it from somuch to the kira is because shihui is achas, same shihui. Now, let's be ma'ayin for a moment. Bishloima, if we're speaking about a case of a smichus which would be osir to do on Shabbos, dahainu, without mechitza mafsekes, too close to the eish, or even with a mechitza mafsekes, according to those achroinim that I'm not allowed to be soymech b'Shabbos, not like the maskon of the Mishnah Berurah, like Rabbi Kiva Eger, then we can understand very well that if such a smichus was done erev Shabbos, but would be osir to do on Shabbos, then by definition, what that means is if it's osir to do on Shabbos, that means it's too close to the eish. It's called al ha'esh. Then we can readily understand that I could move it from that state of smichus to al ha'esh, shihu yachasi. But if the kedera is in a state of smichus that would be mutter on Shabbos, to do on Shabbos, so Dr. Rajba, we just saw, why is it mutter to put it a good distance from the eish? Because no one is mavasha like that. It's not al ha'esh. There's a heker, it's too far. Or if we have a mechitza mafsekes, it's not enough al ha'esh, and therefore there's no chashash me'yechatet. Even in that case, is the Chazon Ish saying it's mutter to move the kira, the kedera, from there al ha'esh? Why should that be? By definition, the reason why that smichus is mutter b'Shabbos is because it's not al ha'esh. So now I can change it and move it to al ha'esh. So the Chazon Ish is vague. The Chazon Ish isn't telling us what's the case that smicha to al gabo is mutter. Is it a smicha that would be osir to do on Shabbos and was done erev Shabbos in an oifen hamutter, and then we can readily understand why it's mutter to bring it al ha'esh, because since it's osir to do on Shabbos, it means it's al ha'esh. Or is the Chazon Ish even being matir in a case where the smichus would be mutter on Shabbos, and still zot the Chazon Ish, even though that smichus is mutter on Shabbos, which means it's distance from the eish, or there's a mechitza mafsekes according to those achreinim, but still it's somehow enough associated with the eish that it wouldn't be called the Pula Chadasha. What case is the Chazon Ish talking about? Sosa. And there's, as we'll see, a very broad nafkamina. If we want to utilize this heter of the Chazon Ish, what case the Chazon Ish is talking about? So we find l'chura in this a machloikes gedolei aposkim. Reb Chaim Kanievsky, b'ktsara in his Sefer Shoina Halachas, says
that's what this is. Chaim.
that the Chazon Ish is only allowing from smicha ta'al gabo is because the Chazon Ish himself paskins like Rabbi Kiva Eger and not like the Beis Meir.
Put up the Shein Halachas, please.
And what says this? What does that mean? If we want to see the lashon, Zot it was included in the PDF with the Maramakomis.
Yes. Yes. If you can kindly remark, there we go. It's coming up.
So if one looks in the Shonei Halachas, it's 8 lines down from the Shonei Halachas. The line beginning Shahayad Seiledes by Mutter. In the parentheses, Reb Chaim Bekitzer, in a number of words, addresses our Shaila. And he says, HaChazoinish Simen Lamed Zayin Sivkotin Yud Aleph says what? Va'afilo hoisa mitchila smucha lakira mutalach zir al gaba. Zog Reb Chaim v'nira de zedafka l'shitosoi de oisa lekamon bedin tesvov lismoich lechatchila b'Shabbos. Later in Shoni Halachas in Din Tesvov, Reb Chaim discusses the shaila of the Mishnah Berurah. Can one be soymech to a kira b'Shabbos? Rabbi Kiva Eger or the Beis Meir?
He says no.
Zog the Chazon Ish, I hold like Rabbi Kiva Eger. And it's fascinating to see, and I'm not sure if we're going to have time to address it. If you can, we'll come back to it. That the Chazon Ish says that even though the Bir Alocha has brought a convincing raya from the Rosh, like we said, it's not just the K'tzas Nach, it's a raya. But the Chazon Ish says the pashtus of the lashon of the Gemara is mashma, that the whole shaila of smichos is only Erev Shabbos. Zot the Chazon Ish, the pashtus of the lashon of the Gemara is machriya.
No smich on Shabbos.
No smich on Shabbos. Memela, what's Reb Chaim Bekitzura saying? What Reb Chaim is saying is that the two dinim are dependent on one another. One can only be matir smicha from a state of smicha that one would not be allowed to do on Shabbos. Why? Because by definition, if that smicha is osir on Shabbos, that means it's too much associated with the eish to do it on Shabbos. It would be called shehir lechatchil on the eish. Oh, zot the Chazon Ish. But if you did that erev Shabbos, it al korchoch is sufficiently al ha'eish that it's included in the Rambam's heter of the Yerushalmi of mikira lekira. So mimele, what Reb Chaim has been mechadish is that the Chazon Ish is only matir to move a k'kedera from smichos to al gaba in a case where it's a smichos that would be also to do on Shabbos, namely next to the kiro, because hefsik mechitza doesn't work for smichos on Shabbos. But Rabbi say, in the case of the Rosh in Siman Shin Yud Ches, the second type of smichos, where it's being placed keneged hamadura, sufficiently distanced that it's not considered aloesh, and that is mutter to do even on Shabbos. That's a Gemara. Keneged hamadura is mutter. A mefurish and mechaber. Dovosh is bashal kol tzorku vuyovish mutter la nichoy keneged hamadura. Zok, it would come out according to Reb Chaim that to move it from keneged hamadura tal gabe eish, it's awesome. Awesome. Why? Because since I could do that smichus on Shabbos, so al korchoch, like the Rosh is saying, it's not sufficiently associated to be considered alo eish. It has a heker and it's ein derech bishul bekach. So then you can't move it from there to al gabe eish. The only case the Chazon Ish was matir was a case that's close enough to the eish that it would be also to do it Shabbos. As they state in Reb Chaim. Now, what's been machriach Reb Chaim to say this? Wo steht das in Chazon Ish? Svara? So
and the question on the floor is, he seems to be talking about a tmuna here. And the next few lines in Tchila Haisa Tmuna B'Davar Shem Meisav Hevel.
That's a continuation of the Magen Avram.
That's the words of the Magen Avram.
That's the Magen Avram and the Mishnah. Yeah, it's a summary of the Mishnah Berurah. This parenthesis is referring back to the line before, whether Reb Chaim had preceded the Mishnah Berurah that says,
It's written so because you're lazy, you get it? Okay, it's not talking about money.
It's not talking about money. Now, so that's what Reb Chaim says. What's Mimachriach Reb Chaim? Reb Shlomo Zalman in Mincha Shlomo. On the Maram HaKaimis in the booklet, this is on page 160. Towards the end of the booklet, is quoted the Mincha Shlomo Tinyana, Ha'aras of Reb Shlomo Zalman.
Page 160.
Zok Reb Shlomo Zalman says like this. If you look at the square brackets at the very bottom of the paragraph of Yud Beis, paragraph Yud Beis, right side of the page, the paragraph Yud Beis, Havora mimokom l'mokom al gabei apach. The very end of this, and we'll come back to the Ikra Arichos of Reb Shlomo Zalman Be'ez Hashem Behemshech. We're just going to see first the ha'ara that the Chazon Ish has on the Reb Shlomo Zalman has on the Chazon Ish. He says tzorich iyam. There's a kasha. Im ninkoit, if we'll assume like the Chazon Ish, muter mismicha al gabo, that you can take a kira from a state of smichos to put it on top of the eish. Kimoishe kosav Chazon Ish simin lamed zayin simkot in yud. Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman yehi shori. The following should be mutter. Likach dover yovish in it stand on the gamre. You could take something dry and cold. Oy lach shaloin it stand on the gamre. That's a bishul issue because if something has liquid in it, that's tzoinen as a bishul issue. Therefore, what should be mutter? L'soim chom tchila b'mokam shayad this boy.
The side of the blech.
Place it first on a place of yatzil. That's what we'll discuss the application in a moment. V'achar kach yaniche mamish al eish gara f'ktuma. Zot the Chazon Ish, we now have been mevatel the whole din of Chazara b'Shabbos. I have a simple eitzah, smicha, to be able to put something on an eish gar from cotton b'Shabbos. What's the eitzah? First be sainach, which is mutter, and then after smichos, place it ala eish.
That's where we started from.
So ibazoi, now we not necessarily. It's possible that the case of taking from smicha to ala eish means the smicha was done erev Shabbos.
Oh.
Right? And as is Reb Chaim.
Right.
We're talking about a case that smichus would be also to do on Shabbos, but was done erev Shabbos. Zot the Chazon Ish, if we'll anticipate a case where you can take from smicha to al gabi ha'esh, Zot the Chazon Ish, Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, I have two simple cases to completely circumvent the Isser of Shia B'tchila b'Shabbos. One is place it keneged hamadura, like the Rosh that we learned, and the Shulchan Aruch and Siman Shin Yud Ches. Place it keneged Amadura, b'mokum shayatze ledes boy, so it's already benefiting from the Eish, and then simply take it from there and put it on top of the Kirah of Fuktuma. Mismicha l'shihiyah shari shekula shiachasi. Zot the Chazon Ish is not a pula chadasha, it was samuch. So Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman, so you can do a smicha on Shabbos. I'll just say the next case, and then Bli will take the shayla. The second case would be that if we pass like the Bi'aloch and the Mishnah Berurah, that according to the Beis Meir, smicha even next to a kira is mutter because we have the doifen being mafsik. So take it, place it right next to the kira, and then put it on top of the kira a moment later.
Even if there's no doifen mafsik?
If there's no
can't put it on top of the stove.
We can't put it too samuch. But if there's a doifen mafsik, and we hold like the Beis Meir that doifen mafsik is matter Shabbos, so put it right next to it and then put it on the kira on Shabbos.
Who says you can't? Who says you can't?
So Zot the Chazon Ish, so Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman.
No shir chazara.
Be told to call dinei chazara. All you have to do is put it there for a moment. You don't have to leave it there for a long time. Put it close enough, then it could get. It's in a place where it could get to yatzil this boy. So it's enough considered alo eish. Put it either keneged amadura or put it, and then move it on top of eish. Okay, right. But why? That's it. Let's be ma'ayin in your shayla.
The question.
What's the reason why we require t'noi chazara? What's being asked is that this doesn't fit with what we know of chazara, because chazara always is that it was previously in a state of shihiyah, and now I'm being machzired. Here, everything started on Shabbos. The smichus start on Shabbos, but let's be ma'ayin, Rabbi said. Why do we need t'noi chazara? The Rishonim keseder are being chayzer, because otherwise it's a shihiyah chadasha that began only on Shabbos. Here, the Shia Chadasha didn't begin. Is not an Isser. It's not a Shia Chadasha because it continued from a Smichos. The Smichos was mutter. So I'm merely continuing the Smichos on top of the Kira. What's the problem?
Yeah, but who says the Rishonim allowed that? The Rishonim allowed a shir was done before Shabbos to continue. Who said they allowed something that was created on Shabbos?
Because the only reason why you need to continue the shir of Erev Shabbos is that it shouldn't be k'machzir lechatchila, and here I'm not being machzir lechatchila. The Chazon Ish, Rabbi say again, the lashon of the Chazon Ish, shekula shihu yachasi. That means when I place it on the kira, it's a continuation of the smichos. If the smichos is mutter, so I'm putting on the kira is mutter. Frekt Reb Shlomo Zalman a kushia tsuma on the Chazon Ish. He says, he doesn't say what the Maramakoimus are, but he says, if this would be true, then I should have a very simple eitzah of circumventing the whole din of Shia Lechatchila B'Shabbos.
Why is it in brackets? This is the title of the
The question is why it's in brackets. Because the Gedarli Yisrael write big Shir Klolim in brackets. That's how it works.
I think the reason is, we'll see, is because in the earlier part of the Mincha Shloim, the Chesron seems not like the Chazon Ish, and there isn't a heter. There isn't a heter from smicha to shia. He's just asking the fila Chazon Ish that was matter, but it seems to be it wasn't poshet to Reb Shlomo Zalman that this is the hachra.
Is there a difference between smicha when there's a group of ketum or not?
Is there not in terms of the pashtus, not in terms of the smicha, but only in the ability to then place it on top of the kira gufa ketuma. Smicha avoids the problem of shema yechata because it's a leif and mafsek, which is even without garf and kotum. To place it on top of the
question is whether smicha needs gufa ketuma. The answer is no.
The Gemara is not addressing it. Right? The Gemara says that
because smicha means from the side. There's no shema yechata because it's only some of
that's correct.
It's
possibly more powerful. Yes, but garf and kotum doesn't allow shia lechatchila on Shabbos. We can't place something cold where it's never been there on a garf and kotum. So our whole question is taking it from a smichos to something that's
whether or not smicha requires gruf ketuma. Okay.
So this is so that issue that the Chazon Ish has asked, Reb Chaim has now solved. Because Enoch Hanami, the Chazon Ish was never being matir to take a kidera from a state of smichos that would be mutter to do on Shabbos and put it on top of the kira. There's no such Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish only allowed you to take it from an Erev Shabbos smichos that would be also to do on Shabbos and put it on the kira. And therefore, the whole scenario of Reb Shlomo Zalman that I should begin with the smicha and then place it on top of the kira doesn't begin. And what's the havana in this? What's the svaras hadavar? The svaras hadavar is and bezer nechleku in the understanding of this Chazon Ish is the reason because any association with eish, even if it's in a state of smichos that would be mutter Shabbos, is enough of association with an eish that therefore placing it al gabe kira is just considered one ku'ula, or no? The association with the eish has to be to the degree that would be also to do Shabbos. And therefore that Isra Shabbos demonstrates that it's so closely associated with eish that then when I move it onto the kira, it's hainuach. This is a fundamental suffix in how to understand the Chazon Ish's din that he takes from a diuk in Yerushalmi. Are we talking about dafka where it was samach be'isr, or are we speaking about even in the case where it could be samach be'heter? And the Shlomo Zalman is being ma'oyer that if we understand the Chazon Ish kipshutoi, then we have a noisei legabe why we can't every time Shabbos begin with a smicha and then immediately a chazar. Now let's take this a step further, and Reb Shlomo just
we haven't gotten to the Kedera Legabe Kedera.
Ask a suggestion. Yes, should we go to Kedera Legabe Kedera?
Yeah, we're going to go over time.
Yeah, so let's
we're finishing Chazara, so we need to go over time.
Let's first begin to go to Kedera Legabe Kedera, and then we'll return to positions on a blech, which Leilam was asking about. Yeah. The Chazon Ish in Sifkot and Yud Aleph, page 106 in the Chazon Ish's pages. Right-hand side, Sifkot and Yud Aleph. The Chazon Ish is discussing the common practice of Shihiyah b'Shabbos in the way it was done in the Chazon Ish's time, where there was a blech placed on top of a flame, and then one keli on top of another keli. So, for example, there would be, just to illustrate it practically, there would be a cholent, and on top of the cholent would be put a kettle of hot water. That was the way. The reason why that was done is because their ranges weren't large. The tzir of the Chazon Ish is the eish tachas hapitput, which is just a flame underneath like a tripod. So there was really, it's a one burner range. So therefore space was very limited. So in order to keep everything hot, it was piled one on top of the other. That's the case that the Chazon Ish is discussing. That's why they did it that way. So the Chazon Ish b'soich dvarov, the Chazon Ish says, if you look about 14 lines down, the line beginning kishemashe betchila b'Shabbos. So the Chazon Ish, about 3 lines in, the 3 words into that line, he says, "Notal es beis hakederos." If the 2 kederos were removed, v'roitze lehachzir es ha'elyon toich hapach, and he wants to put the one that was on top now straight onto the blech. The reason why it was called toich hapach is because it had sides, so it had volumes. It's called toich hapach. Ours are flat. That's not relevant to the shayla. Also, it's also to do that, Zot the Chazon Ish. Why? And we'll leave out the next words for a moment. He says, "De choshiv kimashe betchila b'Shabbos." The top one wasn't hala'ish. The bottom one was. To take it from on top of the kedera down to the bottom, masha lechatchila. That's shia. It's as though you're putting it on a ish for the first time on Shabbos. What's the obvious pella Rabbi say? Ma doch in somuch lekira. The Chazon Ish was matir to take from somuch to put alo eish. How could it be that on top of another kedera alo eish, putting it down now al ha'eish is considered shia b'tchila? How does that make sense? It's a stira from the Chazon Ish, literally from one sifkatan to the next. In sifkatan yud, the Chazon Ish told us that from smicha to al gaba is kol shihu yachasi. We have a mechitza mafsekes, or it's rochik min ha'eish. Whatever case we'll say the Chazon Ish is talking about. So why can't we put it down? Now, you'll say, well, maybe this is a proof to Reb Chaim. Maybe this is a proof to Reb Chaim. Because placing one kedera on top of another kedera b'Shabbos, that's alo eish, we're going to see in a moment in Shulchan Aruch is mutter. Shlomo mentioned this before. You can take a davar tzoyin and put it on top of a kedera because ein derech bishul b'kach. So therefore, the state of one kedera on top of another kedera is mutter. So maybe we'll say that according to Reb Chaim, from a smichos that's mutter to do on Shabbos, you can't put it alo eish.
That's not smichos.
Is that a mahalach? What would you? What Rabbi is saying? Svara. What would we hold? Is this a raya to Reb Chaim's mahalach in the Chazon Ish? This is a proof. That it's only mutter to be moirid from the top from smicha to shia, because that smicha will be also b'Shabbos. But if by definition, if the smichas would be mutter, Zot Reb Chaim, then in the Chazon Ish wouldn't allow you to put it on the ish because it's not called shia yachasi. So maybe in this case, since I'm allowed and it's a mefurish Shulchan Aruch, let's see it. We'll see it. It's somewhat truncated in the copy, but if one looks in the
we have it 2 places.
In the Maramakomis
we have
pages.
2 places in the back. It's in the back. You're looking for the end of Gimel.
Yes, the end of Reish and Gimel.
Okay,
yes.
it's 190. It's on the back. 190.
I see it. Yeah, 192 at the top. Yeah. So the Shulchan Aruch says mutter loses al pi kederas chamin b'Shabbos kavshel shenes bashon erev Shabbos kol tzarkoi lefi she'ein derech bishul b'kach. One's allowed to take. Right? It's a common Shabbos morning shayla. One takes a challah that's cold from the freezer, and one puts it on top of the cholent pot that's on the blech. So we have kederas chamin b'Shabbos, something that's mavushal kol tzarkoi. It's awful in this case. You can put it al eish. Chazara, it's mashal lechatchila b'Shabbos, zot the mechaber, ein derech bishul b'kach. Common shayla. So agav, we'll learn in the halachas of bishul, and they say that Yaakov Fisher writes about, is that what happens if there's a lot of ice, frost on the challah, and you're boiling up liquid? That's bishul acha bishul. We'll have a chance to discuss that shayla beis Hashem when we learn the sugis of bishul. But in the common shayla, if the challah is cool and one wants to heat it up, crisp it on Shabbos, put it on top of a k'deir. As I say in Shulchan Aruch. So memele a tabshel al gabe kedera is a smichos that's mutter b'Shabbos. So maybe that would come under the same nidin of Reb Chaim and Reb Shlomo Zalman. if the Chazon Ish's heter was only addressing a case where such a smicha would be also. That might be one possible solution. But Rabbi is saying svara, it's very difficult to accept that. Why? Because how did we explain the basis of Reb Chaim's svara that it's only a smichos that's also b'Shabbos that one can't bring from there to al gabi kira? How did we explain it? We said it's a problem. If that smichos would be also b'Shabbos, al korchov, it's so closely associated with the eish that shiri achasi. How could it be in svara that something that, let's say, for example, the kira is mafsik, which the Chazon Ish says you're also to be soymich to on Shabbos, that's more associated with the eish than a kedera al gabi kedera, which is positioned on top of the eish just with the hefsek of a kedera? Svara, that seems very difficult to accept. Talo eish. It's a kedera being mafsik. It's less associated with the eish than being soymich with the mechitza mafsekes. Seems to be a pellet. Mimele, we're going to need to try and see if we can generate a second svara to explain this Chazon Ish. And with this, we'll come to discuss the shaila that was asked before and was referenced by one of the Lomdim, the din of the basis of the heter that we just saw in Shulchan Aruch and Sif Hey of Kedera al Gabi Kedera, which is called Ein Derech B'Shul B'Kach. Let's see. Let's take it step by step. So let's be ma'ayin now. Let's see, Barboy said the Bir Halacha on page 78 in the Mishnah Berurah's pages. I'm sorry, that may be, I'm sorry. Apologize. This is
Which page? What does Rav need?
Yeah, it's
It's one in the back.
No, it's not the Bir. It's we need the Bir Halacha.
Yizar?
On the Bir Halacha on Mutar Lismoich. I apologize. It's also cut off.
Bir Halacha Mutar Lismoich.
Duration and Gimel Sif Gimel.
Here's the Mishnah Berurah. 1 second.
Yeah. Yes. So it's on page 191 in the booklets pages. The second piece, the second section of the Mishnah Berurah at the bottom. Dibra Maschil vi Zoher Shelo Yosim.
Yizar, right. This is the one with the Pri Megadim. This doesn't have smicha. This is the one with the stewart and gimel and hay.
Correct. The Bir Halacha asks a basic shaila, which the Ilm has been oimed on before, that in Sif Hay, as we just saw, one can take a davar tzayin and place it on top of a kedera. In Sif Gimel, the Mechaber says, Hamashkim baboiker, someone who gets up in the morning and he sees shekedicha tavshiloi, his kedera is becoming overcooked, it's going to be spoiled. He's worried that it will overcook further. You can take it off the flame. Alpi hakira, you can take an additional keli and put it on top of the flame. That's what he can do. So frek the Bir Halacha, this would sound like that it's only mutter to place this tavshel that's overcooking on top of another keli where it was already on the eish before. You're removing it from the eish and replacing it with a barrier of a kedera, of an empty kedera. Frek the Bir Halacha, you're allowed lechatchila to put it on top of another keli b'Shabbos. Why is this only an issue of chazara? You could do a lechatchila. The Mishnah Berurah, the Mechaber says, "V'yizar shelo yaniach kedera al gabi karka." When you transfer it back, make sure you don't put it on the ground first. Why? Put it on the ground, and it's mutar lechatchila to be shoya al gabi keli. You can take something soinen, and it was never alo eish, and put it straight on the eish b'Shabbos. Why not? So the Bir Halacha brings on the Pri Megadim. He says, "Achagach matzosi b'Pri Megadim." Almost at the bottom of the Bir Halacha, it's underlined. Achagach matzosi b'Pri Megadim. There's a small hand next to the Pri Megadim. He says, "Ach matzosi b'Pri Megadim sheyishiv zu akusha b'tuv tam v'hu de b'sifhei ari b'medes al gabi kederes chamin tavshil." It's talking about where the kedera is full. Therefore, says the Pri Megadim, therefore, in that case, lo nechshav klal ka'oimed al gabi kira. It's not like it's on the kira at all. Ulahachi mutar aflitin lechatchila b'Shabbos. Masha'enkin b'inyoneinu shakadei rekonis. Here it's empty in Sif Gimel. For oimedes rak listo imeschayim akira. It's only there to reduce the heat of the kira. Shalayiyah kol chachoim, and therefore all it does is accomplishes gufo ketuma. So Zad the Pri Megadim a chiluk, and the Bialacha calls it the tuftam, and that's his maskana. That the difference between Sif Gimel, where one can only be machzir on top of a kedera, and Sif Hey that says that you can put it lechatchil on top of kedera is whether or not it's full or empty. If it's full, then Zot the Pri Megadim, we don't consider it al-gabi kira. If it's empty, meaning that it's only functioning as a heat barrier to reduce heat, therefore it's considered al-gabi kira. So the Pri Megadim is already opening up that al-gabi keli, al-gabi kedera is not considered al-gabi kira b'chlal. It's not considered al-gabi kira b'chlal. Now the question is, how far can we take that? Can we therefore say it goes so far that it's even better than smicha? Or no? So if we ma'ayin carefully, we'll see that the Chazon Ish understands the Pri Megadim with an additional level of svara, which is not immediately obvious from the Pri Megadim. Should we finish this or continue to blech?
Yeah, let's finish a few moments. Let's finish.
Yes.
Yes.
Page 105 in the Chazon Ish's pages, Dibur HaMaskal Hiksha HaMishnah Berurah. The Chazon Ish quotes the Bir Halacha and the way and the entire Pri Megadim. And the Chazon Ish says a caveat in the heter of the Pri Megadim. He says, Ve'efsh, she'im yesh choim oila lekedera elyono laharticha, if there's heat rising to the top kedera, kigoin she'matachtoino gedoilo maleo bekvedo lahartiach ve'elyono ktana v'noicha lahartiach. Let's say that the tafshel, the lower pot is very full and requires a lot of heat to bring it to boiling point. Very heavy substance in it. The top is a much lighter substance that is going to boil much quicker based on the heat transfer that's coming up from the kira. Zok the Chazon Ish, in that case, we don't have the heter of the Pri Megadim. He says, in that case, vadai chashiva koimedes ala kira. It's certainly considered that it's ala kira. In other words, Zok the Chazon Ish, the accomplishment why the Pri Megadim of kedera al gabi kira of kedera, and why the Pri Megadim has a right to say that the kedera elyono, the top part, is not associated with the kira bichlal, is because the bottom kedera reduces the flow of heat to such an extent that the top kedera is only benefiting marginally from the kira. But lu'itzuya, the kedera elyono would benefit much more from heat than the bottom. It's not the Chazon Ish that we know at. He fears the Chazon Ish, and he says that he says it's absorbing the choim of the kira. It's only getting some of the choim which the kedera transfers to it.
You're getting nothing from the heat.
Because in the case of the kedera rekonis, the heat goes through much more directly. So perhaps we could be matzia that that's the hezber in the Chazon Ish. Why? From smicha to the al-gaba is shihu yachasi. But from kedera al-gabi kedera to al-gabi kira, it's not achasi. Why? Because soif kol soif, wherever it's samuch, the heat of the eish is going directly to the kira. There's nothing else in between that's being boilea that we can then say that the kedera elyono is receiving secondary chaim and not from the kira. Because if it's samuch, even if it's berichuk, it's a direct heat. There's nothing in between being boilea. And huadin, even if there's a mechitza mafsekes, but there's no tavshil that's being boilea such that we consider that the other kedera is getting from the chaim of the tavshil, not from the chaim akira. And therefore, Zot the Chazon Ish, in the case of where it's from the elyon to the tachton, one cannot be machzir b'Shabbos, because that is not shihu yachasi. So perhaps lefi the Chazon Ish in svara, we could then use this chiluk to explain how there shouldn't be a stira in Chazon Ish minei ubei.
So the bottom part has to be full.
Correct. And has to be reducing the heat to the extent that it's only receiving some small source of heat from the tachtoina in order to have the heter. Correct. I'm sorry?
If you don't, according to the sheet that you don't
According to Bir
That you could be
Halacha.
soimech. That you could be soimech.
The question was, according to Chazon, she needed food.
According to the Dogma Mervava, that doesn't hold to the Pri Megadim. According to the Dogma Mervava, that will take a change. So we're saying that the Chazon Ish is going the Shitasoi, that he passes like the Maskon of the Mishnah Berurah with the Pri Megadim the way he explains it. Right? That's the Svarim. Correct. So just the Firois for a moment with the Zisa Lomdus. That's Mavur in Rav Hirsch Pesach Frank. Tzvi Pesach in Tal Horim in Har Tzvi. It's on the Marmaklem, it's included in the PDF. The Tzvi Pesach discusses this very shaila. Kedera al gabe kedera. Can you take it down from the top to the bottom? It's a common shaila in Eretz Yisrael, right? In the one burner, in the one flame burner. Zok the Talalei Sodeh. That's the grandson of Rav Hirsch Pesach, Rabbi Yosef Kohen, father of David Kohen, the Rashiv of Chevron Shlita. He says, he understood from the Har Tzvi that what are the stodim in this shaila, if you can take it down from the top to the bottom.
Put on the Har Tzvi.
The shaila is, do we consider Kedera al Gabe Kedera as being one large Kedera? And therefore the Elyoina is al Gabe Ha'esh to all intents and purposes. It's only mutter because it's ein derech b'shul v'kach. But fundamentally we see them as one combined entity. Or do we say no? The Elyoina and the Tachtoina are distinct, so that the Elyoina is not al Ha'esh and the Tachtoina is al Ha'esh. The nafkimina will be Zak the Talalei Sodeh and Be'ez Hashem will learn this when we learn Hatmana. Let's say the bottom keli is tomun, and I put another keli on top of it. Can I expand the hatmana to include the top keli? If a keli al gabe keli is one entity, so then the hatmana that's on the bottom can be extended to the top. If it's two separate entities, there's no heter, and he shows that the Pri Megadim is Musafak B'Akas. And we'll see this b'linei when we learn the sugis of hatmana. So Homiyas Rabbi say what we have now is we learned two nidanim. From Smicha to Shehiyah and from Al-Gaba to Al-Gabe Ha'esh. And the time hasn't allowed us, but perhaps we'll have an opportunity to discuss this further when we learn the Sugis of Hatmana, that this leads to the broad shaila of being able to bring something on the blech from where it's distanced from the flame to where it's closer to the fire. Is that considered Chazara, or is it mutter from Smicha to Shehiyah? And that Be'ez Hashem will have a chance to discuss.
Shaila was whether something on a blech, which is not directly in the flame, is Smicha enough to consider it Smicha to Shehiyah.
So perhaps in Reb Shlomo in the Chazara, you'll perhaps review with the Olam the Chuvas of the Igros Moshe and try to be aimed on the Stiras of the one.
Yeah, we'll get to that again.
Just to finish, Rabbi Yisrael, just very brief Divrei Agoda. This week is Parshas Chukas. There are years in which the kvius is that Chukas and Balak is combined. Now, we know that in Eretz Yisrael, the parashiyos are 1 week ahead from where we are. Because the last day of Pesach in the Chutz La'aretz was Shabbos. So we, so to speak, missed the parasha, and Eretz Yisrael, they already laned after Pesach. And when we're still Yom Tov with us, therefore Eretz Yisrael is one parasha ahead. This week in Eretz Yisrael, by Adam Chutz La'aretz, it's Chukas. In Eretz Yisrael, it's Balak. The shaila is we now have our first opportunity to catch up with Eretz Yisrael.
Yeah, before that.
When did we have it before?
We had two passages.
Which ones?
No, there's no smicha since
Pesach. So the teretz is that we can't do because we always need that Parshas Bamidbar should be before Shavuos. We need Bechukaisai to be before Shavuos, and we need 1 week to be mafsik between Klolos and Yontif, and then we have it. So we had no tzirufim in Sefer Vayikra. The first tziruf that we have in Sefer Bamidbar is Chukas Balak, and there's some years where that's the tziruf. The Marit was asked the Shaila, and Erechaim Simon Daled, the Marit was asked the Shaila, why don't us B'nei Chutz La'aretz combine Chukas Balak and catch up to Eretz Yisrael? As the Marit was asked. So the Marit says that in most years, the two parashas that we combine, so that Parashas Dvarim is always before Tisha B'Av, is Matas Maseh. So if we have a choice to combine Chukas Balak or to combine Matas Maseh, we prefer to combine Matas Maseh because we want to leave it like Roiv Shon. We want to leave it like Roiv Shon. The shaila is Hagufa. Why by Roiv Shonim do we combine Matas Maseh and not Chukas Balak? Why? Why Taka? So the Marit is mashma because we want to combine the Gemara of Sefer Bamidbar. It is mashma and the Marit, not clear, but it is mashma. We want to combine the Gemara. There's a Dover Nifla, we'll just mention this, and we'll finish. The Bnei Yisachar in two places, one in Mamori Chodesh Tammuz Av and the other in the Bnei Yisachar Sefer in Agra de Pirka. The Bnei Yisachar says a Dover Nifla. He says we want to have that within the 3 weeks, within the Mei Bein HaMetzarim, we should always be learning 3 parashiyos: Pinchas, Matis, and Maseh. We always want that. Why? Zog the Bnei Yisachar, because I just read that as Lashon, it's a Lashon Nifla. He says the Mahadrinon, we try Kolma de Efsha Likras Aparshias Shemevur Behem Chalukas Ha'oretz B'mei Bein HaMetzarim. We always want the Parshias of Chalukas Ha'oretz, Matis and Maseh, to be in the Yemei Bein HaMetzarim. We always want that. Why? He says Lezeh Koirim Elu Aparshias Tomid B'mei Bein HaMetzarim L'choiros Havtocha Yisrael. To show Klal Yisrael that the parsha of Chalukas Ha'aretz will be Negea once again. Le'ele ticholek ha'aretz gamke. It wasn't just to the door of Yitzim Mitzrayim, it's to us too. He says, V'hine gamba parshas Pinchas mevur Chalukas Ha'aretz. In Parshas Pinchas, there's also mevur, the seder of Chalukas Ha'aretz. Al kein mahadrinon kol ma de efsher sheyikru gam Parshas Pinchas b'yomim ha'ele. Nifla. It says we always want to have in the last Shabbos of Yemei Ben Otzarim, we have Parshas Dvarim, one Shabbos Matis Maseh, one Shabbos Parshas Pinchas. That's what we always want to have. We want to chaparain Pinchas, and Matis and Maseh, and Dvarim in Dvarim, because we always have Parshas Dvarim before Tisha B'Av. We want to chaparain Pinchas and Matis and Maseh. We always want to have that.
We catch up now.
So Matis and Maseh are combined in order to have all the parashas of Chalukah, and we want to have parashas Pinchas. If we would separate Matis and Maseh, then what would come out? We'd have Dvarim, Maseh, Matos. When would parashas Pinchas be?
Before.
The Shabbos before the Yemei Bein HaMetzarim, Zot the Bnei Yisachar. We want to have all the parashas that are Oiseh b'Chalukas Ha'aretz in Yemei Bein HaMetzarim. Mosik. Mimele Zokter, that's why in the As B'nei Chutz La'aretz, that's why we don't combine back to B'nei Eretz Yisrael until now. Because Le'ele Ticholei Ka'aretz, the Havtacha is said to us also. That's our Nechama in the Yemei Bein HaMetzarim. That's why we don't combine Chukas and Balak. Firterois, one more Dover Nifla, Rabbi said, Dover Mosik from the B'nei Yisachar. He says there's another thing in Parshas Pinchas, Parshas HaMoyadim. Zokter hine Yisnachmu Yisrael, B'choisef lehem Moyadim B'meheira. Zokter, we also want Parshas HaMoyadim in the Yemei Bein HaMetzarim, because there's going to be a chiddush in Parshas HaMoyadim L'Asid Lavoi, and that's going to be that these Yom are going to be Nepach L'Sasan L'Simcha. He says in Agra de Pirka, he says, "Besura toiva liYisrael b'yomim alolu, shasidim liras ha'aret, v'ayomim ha'elu yiyu l'sasan l'simcha l'yomim toiva." That the kedusha of Minhag Yisrael. That's our nechama, that we have Pinchas, Matis Maseh, and then Dvarim. In order to be able to have Parshas Pinchas and Matis Maseh in the Yemei Bein HaMetzarim, le'ela the Havtacha le'ela Ticholei Ka'aretz.
Beautiful. Okay, everybody's side. Tonight, 8:45, there'll be a Chazara Shir. Maybe we'll try to go into the Blechish, I'm not sure. On Sunday, the Chazara will be speaking about